You know that when I start with a story, very often I take things from real life that people can easily relate to. I don't know what's the program called in Australia. I'm pretty sure they have a program like that. But I remember back in Holland that I was watching a program on TV. I think it's called Meet the Cleaners. Anybody know that program called Meet the Cleaners? I think it's a British program. Am I correct? Yeah. I think so, right? It's one of these programs where a team of people come inside of a house that is a mess. And it's not a mess because they're renovating something or they're under construction, but it's because the owner of the one that is renting the place is just very messy. To the point that literally rubbish is all over the place, and you know, you start seeing rats and mice and cockroaches and all kind of very interesting animals walking all over the place, till the point that somebody, whether it's a neighbor or maybe a family member or relative, says like, till here and no further. So they call this program, and then that program, they make something happen to make sure that this owner or whoever is living there goes out of the house for a little while so that they can, you know, do their stuff in the house. I think it's sometimes hilarious, those programs, because sometimes you see the owner of the house, you see yourself that it's absolutely rubbish, and then the owner of the house is still looking like, I'm not so sure if I want to throw this away. It's really, really hard for me to do this. Yeah? The amazing part of those programs is that sometimes, I'm not sure if it's Meet the Cleaners, they have a Dutch version as well, where they clean up the entire home, and then the owner can go back to the home, and in the beginning he's a bit like reserved about what he's seeing because everything looks so beautiful and clean and everything, but he doesn't know where the things are anymore. He's completely lost in his own home. It reminds me of a story that happened to my own parents many years ago. Janini remembers the story. As a matter of fact, before I come to that story, you know what the first encounter of future daughter-in-law, Janini, was with my parents, as she came into the house. As she came into the house back in a tiny little village in the southern part of Holland, I warned her before. I was like, Janini, let me just tell you something. My parents, particularly my mom, they are very good-hearted people. But remember, my dad and my mom, they were born around the Second World War and stuff, and they hold on to things. That, you know, poverty and not wanting to get rid of the kind of stuff, that's something very normal. So I showed her one of the rooms, where it was a computer room, and I opened one of the closets, something that I shouldn't have done. Because as I opened the wardrobe, I showed her, listen, these are the clothes from the 60s. And I went to the next wardrobe. These are the clothes from the 70s. And I went on and I showed the part, like the attic. I showed all kind of places, clothes and toys that I used to play with. By all means, I'm 42 years old now, but we still have some of those toys. And I was showing her around. This is like 20 years ago. And she was like, no. They still have all of that stuff? And that is the polite version. She might have to right? I remember also that years later, I mean, this was her first encounter. A couple of years later, we moved to Brazil. Joshua was already there. Rebecca was born. And my parents had this beautiful idea to come over to Brazil for 3 months. Now imagine if you have your in-laws over for 3 months. How that could look like.
Great.
Well, it was amazing. In the end, they were traveling themselves as well. They rented a place somewhere, so they weren't all the time staying at our place. It didn't even fit back then. But it was funny. It was exactly in those 3 months that my older brother and my sister and my younger brother had this beautiful idea, and Joshua remembers this. They're like, you know what? We already had kind of a side conversation with my dad, and there's a lot of stuff that he would like to get rid of, but he doesn't have the courage because he knows once he does it, even when he throws it in the rubbish container, then the next morning it's somewhere in the house again. So my parents were with us for 3 months in Brazil, and my brother, he ordered a container. And they're like, what is he doing with this container? And he said like, well, I'm gonna go to the attic, which was the most critical area of the house, where literally the clothes of the 60s and the 70s and all of that stuff, it was all dumped there, toys and all kind of stuff, not rubbish, but still stuff that you think like, my goodness, what are you going to do with it? And they were putting it all in categories. It's like, okay, this is we're going to put on, you would call it Gumtree, not Gumtree in Holland, but it's the same version, you would understand it. Sell it, get rid of it, even make some money with it, because what's the point of having Patrick's little, wooden tray or something to be sitting around there? What's the point of keeping all that stuff? So they were either selling lots of stuff or literally throwing things away that everybody understood it was just rubbish. 3 months passed by. My parents got home, they opened the door, and they looked at their room and said, like, my goodness, what happened here? Now my question to you is, do you think they were happily surprised or they were a bit like,
Locked up.
They were shocked. They were a bit shocked, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. In the end, my dad also was a bit shocked in the sense like he didn't see that much coming, and that's he was a little bit aware of what was coming, but not the full picture. My mom was completely shocked. It was like, my goodness, what is going on? Now, why am I telling this story? Why am I telling this story? I'm going to make the plot very obvious to you very soon. It has to do with when renewing things, when renewal starts to happen in your life. Picture your life as a house, all right, with all kind of things. And God wants to clean the house, let me put it like this, meet the cleaners. It's sometimes our human nature to be like my parents or sometimes these house owners, where we try to hold on to certain things in our life that might be very dear. Now, they're not necessarily things. It might be attitudes, might be thought patterns, might be stuff that we're so familiar with. And I'm going to explain that today in today's class. All right? So last week, all right, we go to the lesson now. The fun, all right, it's over. Now to the serious stuff. Last week, I called the lesson Clash of Clans, right? And it had all to do with spiritual warfare and the fact that I see him always leave me. Every time. Where was I? No, it just distracted me, that's it. Last week we were talking about spiritual warfare and the importance of using the entire armor of God. I was talking about Ephesians 6, and it's important to walk in faith, see yourself as righteous, not self-righteous, but righteous. Wear the helmet of salvation, all of that stuff together, because that in itself is your protection. Your identity is your protection. That I was talking about, all right? But now something else also is that we still live in a world, even though we can walk in our identity and we kind of feel protected, not taking the battle personal, that was my first point. We still live in a world where there is a lot of brokenness. I mean, just look around. Stuff that you say like, okay, I found my identity, I know who I am, but still when I look around there is so much stuff that doesn't seem to make sense. Makes sense, right? And on top of that, what I also said a couple of lessons ago is that even though we are saved and God looks at you and at me as a new creation, which starts in your spiritual you, the part that we can't see, there is still a renewal process going on that has to do with our way of thinking, our emotions, and our desires. And it is in this area where the clash of clans, or where the spiritual warfare is still going on. Alright? Because even though when we are saved, there is still all kind of stuff that God needs to deal with in your life and in my life. I remember the day that I got saved, it didn't mean necessarily that all of a sudden my way of thinking completely changed. That was a process that took quite some time, in which the Holy Spirit, remember that lesson, was teaching me new truths about who God really is, and also started to show me new truths about who I was. Because I sometimes look at myself into the mirror and I didn't necessarily like myself or love myself or thought that I was a nice person or any of that stuff. It is in this arena, our soul, thinking, desiring, emotions, all of that stuff, that there is really a lot of transformation that needs to take place. And it is also in this area where the enemy of our soul knows that we might have certain vulnerabilities. If we cling on to certain thought patterns, emotional patterns, desires, that deep down inside we might know they're not helping us, but we cherish them. Remember the house? Cleaning up the house? It's sometimes difficult to let go of certain things. What the Bible calls those things that we might want to cling on to, whether we sometimes realize it or not, it's called a stronghold. Any of you like to watch these old movies with castles and knights and that kind of stuff? Yes? Alright. Well, then you can also picture yourself, and some of you are visual learners here, I think, so I'm going to try to paint a picture here. A stronghold could be pictured as a walled city in ancient times. Can you picture it? And then a big battalion that could hide within this area. It's safe there, alright? And the Bible talks about tearing down those strongholds. I'm going to read for you, and you can just listen to it if you want to write down where I got it from. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 to 5. It says this, and I'm reading it from quite a modern translation, which makes it maybe a little bit easier to understand. It says this, we are human, but we don't wage war as humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down, in other words, to tear down, which might be a bit stronger, the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. We capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. Alright? So there are certain thought patterns that are not necessarily even human. It's simply suggestions, half-truths, deception, suggestions of the enemy of our soul that's trying to twist our understanding in certain areas of life. Alright? Makes sense? And there is the area where the devil tries to inhabit certain ways of thinking in our lives. For instance, negativity. For many, many years on end, I had the natural tendency to think negatively. First of all about myself, but very often also about whether it was the future or even people around me. I would first see the negative before I saw the positive. Well, question, is that the way that Jesus Christ would reason and think? Obviously, the answer is no. So there was an area in my life, and there is still an area where I know I need to be at least aware of, because it's a tendency that can, creep up just like this. It's in these broken thoughts patterns where the enemy of our souls tries to find footage, an entrance, to hide himself. You don't even see it, you don't even realize it very often, but he is doing it from that stronghold position, and it is from that place that he starts doing exploits and start attacking you in ways that you never ever thought. Any of you sometimes had this tendency that you say, oh my goodness, I wish that my mind could just turn off for a second. My mind just keeps on going, and it's not necessarily even positive. Do you understand what I'm now talking about? This is what I'm talking about. It's this stuff that constantly seems to be nagging us in some way, and it isn't positive. The Bible calls them strongholds. And now stronghold, before we're going to spiritualize all kind of things, or I'm going to share stuff that you might get very afraid of, which you don't need to, which I already explained last time. It's important for us to understand this. Alright? You and I, we cannot afford to entertain thoughts about ourselves, or about God, or about others, that God doesn't have. Let me repeat that. You and I, we cannot afford to entertain, to keep on lingering on thoughts about ourselves, about God, or about other people that God doesn't have about us, or other people, or about Himself. Does that make sense? Let that sink in. That's very important to understand. So we were talking about strongholds, right? How does these strongholds look like? Because like I said, the word stronghold, and I see people a little bit looking like, I wonder what he means with a stronghold. Jesus gave a very good illustration when he warned his own disciples of mentalities and thought patterns that weren't very helpful. If you go to Mark 8 verse 15, and you can read it, it's in your manual, it says this. Jesus was saying this to his disciples. I will give you the context of this verse. He said this: "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." Alright? Let me repeat that. Take heed, be careful, beware of the leaven. Those of you that like to cook, what is leaven? Help me out here. Yeast, something that will grow and it will permeate the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So you can think of bread, for instance. Alright. So beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. What is the context of what Jesus is saying here? Because he said it for a reason. Just before he said this, Jesus showed to his disciples not once, but twice, that in the kingdom of God, resources are not the problem. He multiplied bread and fish for 5,000 men one time and 4,000 men the other time. It says men. The reason why they only said men, because it was an old ancient culture, but probably it was the entire village was there. Thousands and thousands of people. And they saw, as the disciples were distributing the bread and fish, in their own very hands, the multiplication that with our own minds we can probably not even understand it happening. Not once, but twice. Now imagine the scene. They were probably working for hours on end, super tired. They get back on the boat again. They go around the shore of the lake that they were going to the lake of Gennesaret. And all of a sudden they realize, oh shoot, we forgot bread. They just multiplied, I don't know, bread and fish for I don't know how many people. And all of a sudden, instead of trusting the Lord, having faith, they started worrying and being fearful about their own provision. And it is in this context that Jesus all of a sudden says this: "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." It's a strong reference to bread, right? They just had seen the miracle, but somehow it didn't change their way of thinking. Now you might wonder what you mean, the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. I heard one pastor once explaining it like this, and I think he has a point there. He has merit. He said this: the leaven of the Pharisees is basically the religious system of the temple, or you might even think the church, where God is in the system, but He is impersonal. You cannot relate to Him, and He is powerless. No relationship. Alright? So the leaven of the Pharisees, religious system. Rules without relationship. You might say it that way as well. Then the leaven of Herod. Herod was the king. Political system. He says like this: well, that can very well represent a fallen, humanistic reasoning that actually hurts our identity. Because it's not found in Christ, but in worldly thinking. Power plays. That kind of stuff. Knowledge apart from God. Now the disciples, they were still thinking about what in this context? They were still thinking about their tummies. Still thinking about bread. And Jesus was talking about leaven, about something totally different. As a matter of fact, when you go to Mark 8, and I encourage you to read that chapter, it even said that the disciples were reasoning in their hearts. They were reasoning among themselves. It's this reasoning apart from what God can do that got them into trouble. Don't know about you, but when I got saved and when you got saved, something started to shift in your life. All of a sudden, certain thought patterns and things that you used to think that you couldn't even be bothered by in the past, all of a sudden you start realizing, like, hey, wait a second. Why am I thinking this way? I don't think I'm supposed to think this way. That's God's Spirit that is nodding when you're conscious and saying, like, hey, you're not supposed to live this way. You are so much more than what you're right now living for. I don't know about you, but life can be tough sometimes. And transformation is always happening in our lives, whether we want it or not. Right now, all of us, this week, this month, things happened in our life that transformed us. Some of the things that happened in our life transformed us for the better, but maybe some things also transformed us in ways that didn't change us for the better. For instance, the inward pressures, the stuff that we experience from our inside, they mold and shape us very much. The thoughts that we have about ourselves or people around us, the emotions that we have, the things that cross our mind when somebody might not do us the right way, it's this inward stuff that we're talking about that can transform us. But it can go both ways. It can go in a good direction, but it sometimes also can go in a not so good direction. On top of that, there are also outward pressures. I have a couple of Asians here among us. Do you know anything about outward pressures in terms of family expectations? What family members expect from you, how you're supposed to live your life? I mean, I'm not just talking to the Asians here, like there are other people here, obviously as well. But there are certain cultures where that value is very strong. Extremely strong. And all of a sudden, that outward pressure, that can be your job, it can be society, it can be all kinds of things, outward towards you, can start molding you as well. So the thing is not that you won't be transformed. Everybody here in the room, if you look 1 year ago till now, something started to change, something started to shift. You might not always have realized that, but that is what did happen. It is the Apostle Paul that said, listen, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That is the end goal. You might as well call this entire course a course to learn to be renewed in your mind. It's something that you can do yourself, but it's something that needs to happen. Alright? Last week I also said something very important. You and I, we are in a fight. Remember that there's a spiritual battle going on, spiritual warfare. But the spiritual battle is not trying not to sin. Remember the 2 lessons I taught you about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? You try to live the Christian life really hard on your own willpower, well, good luck with that. You will set yourself up for failure. And a lot of Christians try to do it that way, only come to the realization like, I can't make it. And then they do 2 things. Either they get frustrated and try really hard the next time, or they simply give up. And they say, you know what, as good as it gets, can't get it better. And they indulge themselves in sins and say, like, you know what, God, you made me this way, can't change myself, I'm sorry, this is what it is. But you know what, I prayed that prayer one day, and one day I'll go to heaven. Until that day, I will just live my own life because I don't know how to change myself. That is not the fight we are in. Our fight is not trying not to sin. Our fight is to stand firm and fight the good fight of faith. Now, let me help you out a little bit. I told so many times how important it is to walk by faith, to believe, to have faith. For instance, number 1, Romans 5 verse 1, we are justified by faith. Only you can come to God because God has declared you okay, justified, but it was also based on your faith. If you didn't believe it, then God says, well, sorry, then I cannot do anything for you either. It is also God's grace that transforms us. Remember, grace meets faith. Remember that lesson? Very important to understand. It's faith that activates grace to start working in our life. Think about it like a toolbox. Some of you that are, do-it-yourself people, do-it-yourself. Grace is nothing but a tool of God that He uses to chisel off whatever He thinks needs to be chiseled off. But He will only do that when you say, yes, Lord, I allow you to. He's not going to override you. Like, Jude, I see all that crap in your life. I'm going to chisel it away. If you say, no, Lord, I don't want it, then the God, through the Spirit, says, okay, I will wait. I will respect it. He's a gentleman. He doesn't barge in. Because He respects our free will. He respects that very, very much. Alright? So we can understand that faith is incredibly important for us to understand in this whole fight that we're in. This battle that we're in. Alright? But here is the thing. And I believe that these are the days that we are living in also. Paul said that in the end of time, in the end of days, and he was talking to Christians. He wasn't talking to pagans that did whatever. He was talking to Christians 2,000 years ago.